To paraphrase an old cliche, I kind of see the pastoral ministry as being where the gospel meets the road. And in my pastoral ministry, I traveled down several different roads of various kinds. Also, while in the pastorate, I served during the pastorate and into retirement for 25 years as a stated clerk of Kiskimindis Presbytery. After retirement, I served as interim pastor twice at a yoke field, and then once in a single parish in the county seat of Kittanning. I also taught Presbyterian polity and program here at this seminary. Over the time in the pastorate, and perhaps a little bit since, I have developed several principles of pastoral ministry, things that I felt were important. I'll read these to you. They're not in order of importance because every parish requires a different kind of competence, it seems. But here they are. The first is to get to know the people of the congregation, their work, their interests, their family concerns, and all this I see as the importance of visitation. Important also is ministry to both youth and older adults. Also, another important thing is Christian education. A fourth one, training in evangelism and stewardship for the officers and the congregation. A fifth is preaching that is educational and challenging. A sixth principle that I tried to hold to was involvement in the community. A seventh principle was respect for the opinions of the elders and other officers in the church, as well as members of the congregation. Also, an eighth principle is involvement in church councils, local associations of pastors, other groupings of pastors and lay people with whom you might be associated. And the last is to deal responsibly with social issues in several different ways. And that can get you into some trouble, of course. Now, some reflections on ministry through my years, and I'm going to kind of go hit along these, starting with the first pastorate I had, so you will either see progress or the other way. I'm not sure which you'll see in my ministry here. My first pastorate was in a, pardon me, a national missions field in the northern panhandle of West Virginia. Now, for some of you who are younger, national missions was a very important department within the Presbyterian Church at one time, and part of my pay came from the Board of National Missions at these churches. First, one of the churches was a church it's called the Wolf Run Presbyterian Church. It's one of the oldest Presbyterian churches in West Virginia. They had 40 members who were wonderful people. But that was only the Presbyterians. Now, this church had been closed at one time and then reopened. And when it reopened, it became kind of a community church. The result was that there were several denominations, or people of various denominations, attending that particular congregation. And that worked out well. The only problem we ever had was deciding who was a Presbyterian and who wasn't, so that when we elected officers, we got Presbyterians instead of a Roman Catholic or a Methodist or a Baptist or something like this. An interesting thing about this congregation that most of them were dairy farmers. And so we had to adjust our worship services based on when the cows were milked. Now, that may sound strange, but that's how we did it. For part of the year, we had worship in the morning after the cows were milked. Part of the year, we had worship in the evening after the cows were milked. That church also, like many churches in western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and on south, had an Appalachian mentality. This meant that you had to earn their trust. I knew this because my wife was a West Virginian. And I had to earn her trust too. It took me 3 years to do it, but I did it. To illustrate what happened, this kind of thing in that small church, I was there for 3.5 years before I had my first baptism. Why? Not because we didn't have children in the church, but because they wanted to be sure that I was good enough to baptize their children. And I didn't have a baptism until one of the younger couples there, who didn't seem to have as much of that mentality, decided they wanted to have their baby baptized. Well, this was made known, and at a single worship service, I baptized 11 children and 2 adults. Now, this is out of a congregation of 40 plus people. One of the other unique things in that congregation was that when it came time to have some communion, confirmation classes for the youth, it was decided we'd meet in the homes of the parents' homes instead of having classes in the church, because they were scattered so far and wide around that church. It's a very rural church. The church sat out in the boondocks all by itself almost. Two of the young ladies who were in that first confirmation class had been raised in a Baptist family, and so they wanted to be baptized by immersion. Now, that meant either doing it in the creek, which I wasn't about to do, but the alternative was that I made arrangements with the Church of the Brethren and pastor of the Church of the Brethren in Cameron, and we used their baptistry there for a baptism. So, your Presbyterian pastor baptized by immersion. And the pastor was kind enough to show me how to do it without drowning the person. Later on, about 20 years later, I went to an anniversary celebration of this little Wolf Run church, and there was one of the 2 young ladies that I had baptized by immersion. She had become an elder, had a family, a husband and family, and was a very active person in that church. And then just a very short time ago, I happened to see her picture in a magazine entitled Golden Seal. Maybe some of you have seen that. It's a publication of the West Virginia Cultural Center. And her picture was there because she had played an important role in the restoration of an historical building in Marshall County. So I felt kind of good that I'd had a part in that young lady's life. One of the memorable services, and I'm spending a good bit of time about this first pastor because you always remember, your first pastor more than anything else, I think. One of the memorable services I had in that church was one early spring, or I should say fall days. Church was heated by potbelly stoves which had been connected to gas. And so during the summer, the wasps had built their nest in one of those stoves. Well, this was the Sunday they heated the church up for the first time in the fall. You know where the wasps were? They were flying through the church. I had more wasps than I had congregants that morning. The second church of this three was in Cameron, a little community of about 1,000 people. It was a congregation of about 120 people, mostly elderly. We had a very active youth group there, and a church school that was growing. And there was one of the places I became involved in the community. You know what I did? I coached the 5th grade basketball team. We didn't win many games, but we had a lot of fun. That church eventually, the church school grew to the point that I'd suggested we needed to put an addition on the church for the church school program. And shortly after I left, they took my advice and proceeded to do this, so I've always felt good about that fact. And then there was the Rocklick Church. I had two wonderful congregations of wonderful people. And then I served Rocklick, or third church. They had about 18 members. And they wanted more of my time than the other two churches put together. They also had a strange idea about paying the preacher. They told me once that $5 a week was enough to pay any preacher. And then they decided they couldn't pay me. And so the presbytery decided, well, that's not going to work very well. So they removed me from that congregation, closed the church, and I thought that'd be the end of it. They were still after me. The presbytery had told me to remove all the records, all session records from the church when I left there the last time, which I did. About a month or two later, my wife went to answer the door at the manse in Cameron, where we were living, and I was counseling at a church camp, and here was the sheriff. The congregation had filed charges against me for stealing the records from the church, and this was a summons to court in Moundsville, West Virginia. Fortunately, the presbytery had a pretty good lawyer, so I didn't have to do that. But they were nice people. They threatened to shoot the stated clerk of the presbytery also. But the other two congregations, Cameron and Wolf Run, took over the additional amount that needed. And they were so thrilled to get rid of that congregation, they said, well, we will pay the portion that the National Missions is paying also. So I felt good that out of everything happened there, those two congregations decided to become self-supporting and are to this day, as far as I know. And my second pastoral area, I don't know how much time I've taken here, was in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. This was a church of about 250 members in a small community there. That church had one of the most active sessions I've ever worked with. And they had probably the best stewardship program I ever worked with. As a matter of fact, we'd have a stewardship campaign, and we always had more money pledged than what the budget called for. How many of you have had that happen? It doesn't happen too often. Brownsville had a large black population, and for some reason, I earned the trust of the black community there. To illustrate, while I was there, a radio station was started in the community of Brownsville, and their call letters were WASP. Remember, this was in the mid-'60s. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, some people thought. But I talked to the manager of the radio station there, and he told me that was not the case. Of course, W is the first call letter of all radio stations in east of the Mississippi, except KQV and KDKA. I can't remember what the A stood for. I've forgotten that. But the SP was for Southern Pennsylvania. And of course, one day I got a call from a member of one of the black churches in that community wanting to know about that WASP, W-A-S-P. And I was glad to tell them that, as far as I knew, it was simply the call letters, and here was why the call letters were as they were. One of the things I had always done through my ministry up to this point and at that time was to try to go, when people wanted to baby baptized, to try to go to the home to discuss with them the meaning of baptism and the responsibilities. They were taking the responsibilities of the church also, the congregation also. But one evening, I went to a home where a young lady had had a baby. Her husband was not a member of the church, but she was rather active in the church. So I never met him. And so when I arrived at the home, he opened the door to let me in and greeted me, hello and good evening and so on. And then he said to me, there's one thing I want you to know. I don't like preachers. And so I said, well, I'm glad you told me that. Now I know where I stand. Well, we proceeded to have a very nice conversation with he and his wife about baptizing the baby. And in the process of this, I mentioned that I was going to have a membership class for adults. And I noticed his ears kind of pick up. What's going on here with this guy? And as we kind of finished our conversation, he said, when are you going to have that class? And I gave him the dates. And he said, I'll be there. I almost fell off the couch. What I found out was that he had gone to another Presbyterian church and had wanted to join. And the pastor told him that it didn't really matter much what you believed, just so you joined the church. And that didn't set well with that young man. I'm glad it didn't. It shouldn't set well with a person. He came to the classes. He had to trade jobs. He worked at Pittsburgh Airport and had to switch times with another fellow in order for him to attend the classes. Came to all the classes, united with the church, later became a deacon and served that church well. I felt that was kind of because he felt education was important, and I did too. My third pastorate was, 3 minutes to go here, my third pastorate was in Freeport, Pennsylvania. I left Brownsville, incidentally, because the church building burned down. They united the two congregations. They built a building there, but the understanding was that both pastors had to leave. Well, I went to Freeport, and after I got there, I kind of felt maybe I jumped out of the frying pan into the fire, because the congregation, just the Sunday before I candidated there, had voted to enlarge and update the building there that they were using. The building, the Freeport Church was a combination, or a combined congregation of a former United Presbyterian Church North America church and a former USA congregation. And they had decided to build a new building and to borrow something in the area of $200,000. Now this was in 1969. That would be about like $2 million today. That total congregation was about 500 members, probably about 450 active members. But we engaged the help of the Presbyterian Stewardship Program, which provides people to come in and run a campaign, and we had enough money pledged to go continue the building program, and we eventually paid that debt off. It was a 10-year mortgage. We paid it off in 8 years, thanks to a very generous congregation. But with that enlarged building, we were able to start a youth program for the entire community. We invited all first through sixth graders to this, and then had membership classes for the youth. The first night we opened, we'd asked for registrations, but you know what it's like to get registrations from people for things in the church. We were anticipating about 75 children from first through sixth grade. We ended up, we had somewhere in the area of 115 and 120. Didn't have enough curriculum, we didn't have enough space, hardly enough teachers. It was interesting, but we resolved that and continued. We also began a two-year session, a two-year membership class over 2 years, about a total of 40 sessions over those 2 years. And that was very helpful in educating our youth in what church membership really means. Another challenge there was getting female elders. They weren't opposed to it, they just never got around to electing any female elders. But within a year or so, we were able to elect female elders. And another problem is getting younger people in the session. It's one of these churches, they'd always elected the older people to session. You had to be an elder to be an elder. Well, one day a young fellow came in and said to me, my wife and I are not sure we're going to continue the membership here unless we get some younger people in the session. I said, well, Ray, I said, here's how to do it. I said, you get yourself elected to the nominating committee. And I said, on the nominating committee, you see that some young elders are nominated. Well, Ray was a pretty good talker, and he did it. And we got, eventually, after several years, a pretty well-balanced session of youth and younger people and older people, and actually, a couple cases, high school youth. And we had some interesting session meetings because of that, but it was helpful to the church. I was there 25 years, or both good and bad to say about a 25-year pastorate. But I did feel that God had worked through me to help provide a ministry, both in that congregation and in the community, because while I was there and through the Council of Churches there, or the ministerium, we'd started a food bank, Meals on Wheels program, and several other kinds of things. So I did serve as stated clerk for 25 years, I noted before, and I tried to deal with that work and in a pastoral way. I taught polity, and I tried to teach polity here as one of the important tools to use in pastoral ministry. And I guess one of the last things I did actively within the church, I served on the Synod Judicial Committee. That's an interesting commission to serve on. Okay, I thank you.
Thank John.